least as far as I can tell. Now you could say, well, that's the internal representation of society operating within you. That'd be a Freudian view, that's the superego. And certainly there's something to that, but I don't think it's necessary to presume that that's all there is to it, and even if it is, you still wouldn't have the voice if you didn't have the biological potential to have that voice embed itself in you. So even if it is socioculturally constructed, which it is in part, it's like language. It's like your language is socioculturally constructed, but the reason you can speak is because human beings can speak. And if you have a conscience, it's because human beings have a conscience. And the contents of that conscience might differ, but the fact that it exists, what seems to me to be universal. Okay, so, well, that's the conscience. And that's Jiminy Cricket. And then the cricket opens this book, and then you look at the book, and you think, well, what kind of book is that? Well, it's got a spotlight on it, so it's being highlighted. This is an important book. And what kind of book is it? Well, it's leather bound. It has a lock on it, you know. It's not some cheap book. It's kind of like you might think about it, looks like something from an old library, or maybe it looks biblical, whatever. It's a major league book, and this bug is the introduction to the book. So does that mean your conscience is the introduction to the book? Well, maybe that is what it means. It's certainly what's being played out in the movie. Well, then the cricket opens the book, and so then what do you see? Well, what does that look like? What does it look like? What does it remind you of? Okay, so that's the Van Gogh painting. It's a nativity scene. It's the Christmas star. And you know that because what's going to happen? Well, the hero is going to be born. That's what happens, and so a star signifies that. Why does a star signify the birth of an infant, let's say? Well, because there's something miraculous about the birth of an infant. And why would the infant be a savior, which is the Christian notion, say? Well, because that's what the infant is, potentially. Every infant. And so that's how you should act about them. And you know, one of the things that really is interesting about having little kids, and I loved having little kids, is that you have this opportunity to have this pristine relationship with someone, like a relationship you've never had with anyone, because the kid really is just there to love you. You're like, if you don't screw it up, you've got that. And then you can keep that going, you know, and you can try to keep that relationship like pristine, and that's so fun. It's so fun to try to do that. It's really, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing. And you know, kids get a bad rap in our society, but it's an amazing thing to have little kids, and they are remarkable, and they give you back far more than they require from you, and partly because they treat you like you're valuable beyond belief. That's what the kid thinks about you. It's like, that's pretty good. So yeah, it's like something divine is going to happen. It's so, okay, fine, you know, fair enough. Well, there's the star signifying that, and that's associated in some way with this star that you're supposed to wish upon. Well, that's kind of odd. Like there's this relationship that's implicit. The star that signifies the birth of the hero is the same star that you wish upon. Well, perhaps the star that you're wishing upon is the wish that the hero will be born in your soul. It's something like that. You're aiming at an ideal, right? It's the ideal you, whatever that would be. Well, you can certainly figure out what it isn't. That's where you start, as far as I can tell. You know what you shouldn't be doing, and you could at least stop doing those things and then see what happens, you know. And if you ask yourself, it's a meditative exercise, you know, and you do this with the autobiography to some degree. It's like, okay, sit down for 10 minutes and have a little dialogue with yourself like you actually wanted to know the answer, you know. So you ask, well, I'm probably doing something stupid that if I quit doing, my life would be better, that I could quit doing, that I would quit doing. And maybe it's not a very big thing because you're not very disciplined, but maybe there's something. Ask yourself that question, man. You'll have an answer in no time flat. Like, well, I should stop doing this. It's like, yeah, I know, and I could, and you know, I won't, but, or maybe I would, but if I did, I know my life would be better. It's like, you can figure that out immediately. And if you do that 100 times, well, you'll be in way better shape. So if you don't know what to do that's good, you could at least figure out what you shouldn't do that's just moronically, you know, pathetic, and you can be sure you're doing like a dozen of those things at least, you know, procrastinating, or, you know, you know, everyone, that's what the conscience tells you, and if you ask it, it'll just tell you why you're, you know, stupid and insufficient. And so, who wants to hear that? But maybe you could do something about it. Okay, so the cricket comes into the village there, and he sees this like little house, and there's a little fire in it, and so it's kind of got a welcoming place. It's a light in the darkness, this house, just like the star. And so he hops towards it, and then he ends up inside it, and you know, there's a nice fire, and you get to see the inside, and the inside's, it's cozy, you know, it's welcoming. And then when you look around, you see that everything's kind of in its place. It's not hyper organized or anything like that. It's friendly and welcoming, and there's a lot of wood, and there's a nice fire, and then there's toys everywhere, and they're well constructed. So you know that whoever lives there likes children. And so if someone likes children, well, if someone doesn't like children, it's like you should run away from them very rapidly. But if they like children, well, then that's a good sign that, you know, Jesus, they're at least human. It's a start, you know. And then these things are all high quality. They're made very well. And then and he's looking around to see all of this, and there's toys, and there's clocks, and they're all handmade. And so he sort of infers that maybe there's a wood carver who lives there, and a wood carver is someone who can build things, and if you build things that work and that are beautiful, that's a kind of truth, right? It's like it's built right into the object. That's what quality is. Quality is the building into an object of truth. The thing works. It does what it's supposed to. It has integrity, and so you see that everywhere in here. And so you're getting a sense of the filmmakers are setting the stage, and so. Well, so they set the stage by showing you the stage, and the cricket tells you what he sees, and he's pretty happy to be there because, and this is also someone who's concerned about time, right? Because there's a lot of clocks, and so time turns out to be an important sub-element of this story. And then he sees the puppet, he's a marionette, and so what's a marionette? Well, a marionette, and he's sitting on the shelf, a marionette is something that's quasi-animated, because it can move, it doesn't really have a soul, but it sort of acts like it has a soul, in the sense of anima and soul and animated. But a marionette is something that is being manipulated by something else behind the scenes, right? It doesn't have its own volition. It's dependent on the will of something behind the scenes. And so there's a strong implication that whatever this thing is half formed, and that it's being manipulated by unseen forces behind the facade. Well, that's a Freudian idea. That's you, that's all of you. You know, you're pulled hither and fro by unconscious forces, and some of those are biological and some of them are cultural, you know. And you think about people who are swept up in great ideological movements like the communists or the fascists. It's like those people are marionettes. That's exactly what they are. They all say the same thing. They all mouth the same words. They all act the same way, and something's behind it. And the question is, what? Well, that is the question, and that's partly what this movie tries to figure out. So you see this marionette. He's a half-formed, wooden-headed puppet, and he has a little bit of potential, you know. And the cricket goes up and interacts with him and sees that he's made out of pretty good wood, and makes a little joke about having a wooden head, and you know, that's kind of obvious what that means. And you notice the cricket is dressed like a tramp, and when you first saw him, he wasn't. He was dressed like a 1920s millionaire. So but here he's a tramp, and this is so interesting. It's like, so this bug that's a messiah, that's the introduction to the book, that's the conscience, is also a tramp with no home. It's like, what does that mean? And it took me a long time to sort that out. And it's like, he's been everywhere, this tramp. He's been everywhere, and he knows, he's traveled the world, but he doesn't have a place. He doesn't have a home. He hasn't made a relationship with anything real yet. He's kind of a potential. And this is one of the things that's really interesting about this movie, because if you think about the cricket as a fragment of the hero, and say a reflection of the savior, which is his relationship with JC, of course, and the person who introduces the book, then the story gets strange, because if it was merely a representation of the perfect person, the archetype of the hero, then the conscience would know everything, right? And it would just tell the puppet what to do, and that would be the end of it. But that, first of all, that's a dull story. It's like perfect conscience comes along, puppet does everything it says, bingo, perfection. But that isn't what happens. There's this weird idea that this thing that's got all these attributes needs a home and has to enter into a learning relationship with the thing that it's trying to transform. It's so sophisticated because, you know, I could say, you should do what your conscience tells you. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe that's not exactly how it works. Maybe your conscience isn't omniscient and omnipotent. Maybe it's not God, right? It's a guide. But it's maybe smarter than you sometimes, maybe because it's society in your head. And obviously it's smarter than you sometimes because it tells you not to do something and you go do it and then you get into trouble and you think, well, if I would have just listened, but you don't. And that's interesting too. It's something that you don't have to listen to, which seems to be associated with free will. It's weird. It's like if your conscience knows what to do, why aren't you just a deterministic puppet of your conscience? Christ, that would work a lot better. You wouldn't have to torture yourself and you wouldn't make any mistakes. So why the separation? Well, maybe it's because the conscience is generic. And so it has to be taught. It has to learn too. And so what you do is you have a dialogue with your conscience. It's something like that. And then you expose yourself to more and more of the world and you get wiser and your conscience gets wiser and you mature together. And that's what happens in this story, because the cricket starts out as this tramp that, you know, is smarter than the puppet, but not as smart as he thinks he is, that's for sure. And when he first starts to operate as a conscience, he's completely useless at it. He babbles off a lot of cliches about morality, and then he's late the first day for his job, and he's just not very good at it. And so there's this weird idea that the conscience, which is part of what puts you towards redemption, is something that you actually have to interact with over the course of your life in order for it to develop as you develop. And so then I would also say that the cricket represents, at least in part, what Jung described as the self, which is like the potential, fully developed human being that sort of exists within you as a possibility. But it has to be manifest in the actual conditions of your life. And so the conscience has to learn how to position itself here and now. And it's got generic advice, and that's not good enough. And so that's why the cricket is looking for a home. And so he needs a home, even though he's all these other things we already said he was. He has to find a specific home before he can become who he could be. Well, so then Geppetto shows up, and he's a kindly old guy, which is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. And you know, he's a careful craftsman, and he likes kittens, and you know, that's always a good thing. And he has some fish, and you know, he's good at making things, and he's got a sense of humor, and he's kind of playful, and so he's the good father, fundamentally. He's the wise king. He's the positive archetype of the masculine. And that's what he is. And so he's culture in its positive manifestation, and he gives rise to this creation, which is his puppet, which is what culture does, because you're a puppet of your culture. You're a marionette of your culture. And so maybe you could be more than that. And that's the other thing that's strange about this movie, and it's strange about the mythological way of looking at the world, because scientifically, deterministically, there's nature and there's culture, and you are the deterministic product of the interaction between nature and culture. There's nothing else to you than that. That's that. But the mythological world doesn't say that. It says something different. It says that there's nature and culture, and then there's you. And the you that's in there has choices and a destiny, and that you actually affect the interplay of nature and culture in determining your own character. And it insists upon that. The oldest stories we have, there's always the hero and the archetypal mother and the archetypal father. There's always those three things. There's never just two. So from the narrative perspective, there's always the implication that there's something autonomous about the hero of the story. And you know, you can't account for that. We don't have a good way of accounting for that from a scientific perspective. I was having a discussion with Sam Harris the other day, which was very, what would you say? He said we got wrapped around an axle, which is pretty much, Sam Harris is one of the four famous, you know, atheists, along with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, yeah. And so we were having a discussion, and he's a determinist, just right down to the bottom. It's like you're determined, there's no free will, you're a deterministic machine. And you know, if you're a coherent scientist and you're a Newtonian, roughly speaking, you don't really have much choice other than to think that way, but that isn't how it seems to people. and we don't treat each other that way, and our entire legal system is predicated on the idea that you do in fact have free will.